Hi, my name is Jennings. I'm with the University of Florida Levy County Extension Office, and I want to talk to you today a little bit about selecting beef cuts for grilling. There are over 40 retail cuts of beef, but in my mind there's really only about a half a dozen or so that are really well suited for a quality eating experience when cooked on a grill. You've got dry heat and cooked quickly, so those kind of cuts need to be naturally tender. And there are some simple steps that you can follow when you're selecting meat from the meat case to ensure that your grilling experience is a quality one. So you want to keep your friends and your family happy and impressed, and there's some simple rules that I want to talk to you about. Before we get to that though, I want to talk a little bit about some of the terminology you might see. There are different inspection and grading criteria that federal agencies like the USDA put beef through. Federally inspected beef is all beef that is sold in the United States. You cannot sell beef to the public consumers without it being federally inspected. So sometimes you might see an ad in a newspaper or something where people have in real big prominent place, our beef is federally inspected. Well, good for them. Congratulations, they're following the law. There's nothing really special about that except that we know it is federally inspected and it's wholesome, safe, and ready to go. So we kind of set that aside now, and let's talk about grading a little bit. There are two major types of grading of beef in the United States. The first one is yield grade. And this is one that as a retail consumer, you're really not going to want to pay a lot of attention to. I just want to draw your attention to it in case you hear the term yield grade. It is an industry term that basically measures the amount of lean yield meat from a beef carcass. So it is to value carcass amongst wholesale trade, so not so important for us as a consumer. The second type of grading is very important to us as a consumer, and that is quality grading. Quality grading is based on marbling. And many of you have probably heard the term marbling, and it simply means the small amount of specks of fat that are found within the lean meat. You particularly see this in steaks that you would be selecting from the meat case for grilling. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the marbling differences. So we're going to look at a couple of different steaks here that have a significant amount of marbling difference in them, and they are both ribeye steaks. And you can see on this label we have ribeye steak boneless, so it's clearly labeled exactly what cut that is. And I'm going to show that the marbling would be these smaller specks of fat within this lean meat tissue here. And why that's important is because when this steak is being cooked, that fat somewhat melts into the lean, causing it to be more tender, more juicy, and more flavorful. If we compare it to another ribeye that is still a good quality and it would still grade choice, but there's a little bit less of the marbling in the lean tissue. So what we have here are two choice ribeye steaks, one of which, however, is closer to the upper end of choice, probably getting near to prime. So that brings me to my next point, which is the different quality grades start, the highest one is prime. That one has the most amount of marbling. And we typically only see the prime steak cuts at high-end, what we call white tablecloth restaurants. The next step would be choice, which is typically what you find in your meat case and at most of our average restaurants that probably we go to more on a daily basis, not for a celebratory steak that is usually relatively expensive if it's going to be prime. As we step down to less marbling, we have select and then standard. Standard would have virtually no marbling, and in most cases that's probably going to be ground into a ground product, because we're going to have some inconsistency and tenderness potentially. We also have some other cuts here, and these are all, I'm going to talk about ones that are really kind of my personal favorites first. We already talked about the ribeyes, and this one is a T-bone, which is kind of a classic, and it's got this T-shaped bone which is part of the spine and the rib that runs through it. And you've actually got two separate muscles. You've got this one. If we separate this out from the bone and we cut it off right about there, that would be a top loin steak. And that is basically your ribeye as well, pretty close by. This smaller part here, it would actually be a filet mignon if we separated it out. A close cousin to the T-bone is the porterhouse steak. And the porterhouse looks just like this, but it has a larger section of what would be the tenderloin or filet mignon. So it's kind of like getting two steaks in one. One big one, one smaller, really super tender one. The reason for the difference in tenderness on these steaks, in addition to marbling, is where they come from on the beef carcass. The muscles that don't do as much work are typically much more tender, and those tend to be in the middle of the carcass. If you think a little bit about exercise, and when exercise physiologists talk to us about exercising, you know, when you're really starting to get really down to the nitty-gritty, we start talking about core exercising, because that's the last place that really strengthens. When we have you know, our extremities that do a lot more work with our arms and legs, and it's the same way with beef cattle. So the extremities, like the chuck and the foreleg, the round being the rear leg, doing more work, we generally expect those cuts to be a little less tender. The next cut I want to talk about is one that's a little further back from the ones we just talked about, more toward that round area, but it's still in the loin, which is in that sweet spot of what we call the middle meats. The middle meats would be rib and loin. And this one is a top sirloin, which is another steak that can certainly be grilled easily. Generally would expect this to have a little less consistency of being super tender than the other two that I just talked about. But it can be carefully grilled. Sometimes this one's actually used in shish kebabs or something like that, but maybe a little more slow, moister heat. So the next cut we're going to talk about is the eye of round. And it is from the wholesale cut of round, because it has that right in its name. And remember, that's one of the ones that's away from the middle of the carcass. So we're going to expect this one to be possibly a little less tender on the grill. But this one's sort of an intermediate one where it can be grilled if you're careful with it. But if you have any concerns, you can always use a moister, slower kind of heat to cook this one. Next up is a cut that comes from very far out on the extremity, and it is a beef shank. And that's from a lower portion of the leg, so it's an area that gets a lot of exercise, and certainly we would expect this one to be significantly less tender. You can actually see a lot of the connective tissue running through the lean of this one. So this one is a definite not grill. You know, this one, if you go in a crock pot or a stew with slow, moist heat, and it can be excellent. So I'm going to wrap up with a final one here, going back to, this is kind of one of my personal favorites. This is a New York strip, sometimes called the Kansas City strip, also sometimes known as a top loin steak. It is from that loin region, and it's kind of intermediate in size, a little bit smaller than a T-bone would be. And we don't have that bone in it, which every once in a while I actually kind of like to cook one with a bone in it, but this is a really nice little steak that you can't hardly go wrong with on the grill. So, well, that kind of wraps that up. For more information on this, if you go to beefitswhatfordinner.com, they have a lot of this information in written form on there, and I'm just going to wrap it up by saying I hope you really enjoy working with beef. There are a lot of cuts. Like I said, there's over 40 cuts total, and all of them have a great purpose. If we choose the proper cooking method, and some of them do need that slower, moist heat, but you can't go wrong with one of these 5 or 6 ones that we talked about for grilling. So everybody, happy grilling.